The autumn evening was growing darker as Special Agent Diana Wells drove her black Chrysler 300 through the quiet streets of Richmond, Virginia. After 16 hours of wrapping up a complex human trafficking case, the 35-year-old FBI agent was looking forward to getting home, taking a hot shower, and finally getting some rest. Diana had just finished sending a voice message to her mother, assuring her that she would be there for Sunday dinner this weekend. The clock on her dashboard read 7:45 p.m. when she noticed the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. With 12 years of FBI experience behind her, Diana knew the proper procedure. She turned on her interior lights, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over smoothly to the side of the road. Through her side mirror, Diana watched as Officer James Peterson stepped out of his patrol car. He was a tall white man in his mid-40s, with a rigid posture that spoke of his military background. His hand rested casually on his holster, a standard approach, though something about his body language made Diana's trained instincts prickle with concern. Peterson's flashlight beam swept through her car windows, lingering longer than necessary. Diana noticed his expression shift when the light illuminated her face, his neutral professional mask slipping into something harder, his jaw tightening visibly. "License and registration," Peterson barked, without the usual police greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone was sharp enough to make the couple walking their dog on the sidewalk pause and look over. "Good evening, officer," Diana responded calmly, her FBI training kicking in. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Peterson's face darkened. "You changed lanes without signaling back there. License and registration now." Diana knew this wasn't true. Her FBI defensive driving training had ingrained proper signaling as second nature, and she distinctly remembered using her turn signal at every lane change. Still, she kept her voice steady and professional. "Of course, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment, and my credentials are in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's all right." Peterson's hand tightened on his holster. Slowly, he commanded, his tone carrying an edge of hostility that seemed disproportionate to the situation. With deliberate movements, Diana reached for her purse. As she did so, her FBI badge became visible where it was clipped to her belt, standard practice when she was driving home from work. Peterson's reaction was immediate and aggressive. He stepped back, drawing his weapon halfway out of its holster. "Hands where I can see them. Now." Diana froze, her hands rising slowly. "Officer Peterson, I'm an FBI special agent. My badge is." "Sure you are." Peterson cut her off with a sneer. "And I'm the director of the CIA. You expect me to believe the FBI is hiring." He caught himself, but his meaning was clear in his contemptuous look. Through the patrol car's windshield, Diana could see the dashboard camera recording everything. She also knew her phone, placed on the passenger seat, was still recording her mother's voice message, capturing every word of this encounter. "Sir, if you'll allow me to show you my credentials." "Step out of the vehicle," Peterson ordered, his weapon now fully drawn. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The couple walking their dog had stopped completely now, the woman pulling out her phone to record the scene. Another car slowed as it passed, the driver watching with concern. Diana knew this situation was escalating dangerously. As an FBI agent, she was trained to handle high-pressure situations, but this was different. This wasn't about her badge or her training. This was about something much more fundamental. As she carefully opened her car door, following every procedure perfectly, Diana's mind was already racing ahead. She knew the name of Richmond's police chief, the head of internal affairs, and the local FBI special agent in charge. She knew that what was happening here was going to have consequences, not just for Officer Peterson, but for the entire department. What Officer Peterson didn't know, as he stood there with his hand on his weapon, was that he wasn't just detaining any black woman he'd decided to harass tonight. He was about to learn a hard lesson about power, prejudice, and justice. But for now, Diana kept her face neutral and her movements slow and precise. Sometimes she knew the best response to ignorance was to let it reveal itself fully. "Face the vehicle, hands on the hood," Peterson commanded, his voice carrying down the quiet street. The night was about to become very, very long for everyone involved. The cold metal of Diana's car hood pressed against her palms as Officer Peterson continued his power play. The evening air had grown chiller, But it wasn't the temperature that made Diana's skin prickle. It was the sound of Peterson's boots slowly circling behind her. "Spread your legs wider," Peterson commanded, his voice carrying a tone of satisfaction that made Diana's stomach turn. Several more cars had slowed down to watch the scene, their headlights creating long shadows on the street. "Officer Peterson," Diana spoke clearly, knowing both his body camera and nearby witnesses were recording. "My FBI credentials are in my purse. If you just—" "Shut up," Peterson snapped, moving closer. "I've heard every excuse in the book. You really think I'm going to believe some story about being FBI?" He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the quiet street. "Let me guess, you probably borrowed that fake badge from a Halloween store." Diana remained still, her FBI training warring with her rising anger. She could feel her phone still recording in her car, capturing every word of this encounter. The dog-walking couple had been joined by other neighbors, forming a small crowd of concerned onlookers. Peterson began an unnecessarily rough pat-down, his movements aggressive and unprofessional. "Nice suit," he sneered. "Did you steal that too? Or are you playing dress-up?" A young woman from the growing crowd called out, "She's telling the truth. I've seen her FBI car in the neighborhood before." "Get back," Peterson shouted at the crowd, his face reddening. "This is police business. Interfere, and you'll all be arrested for obstruction." Diana took a slow, careful breath. "Officer Peterson, my name is Special Agent Diana Wells. I'm assigned to the Richmond Field Office, Violent Crimes Division. My supervisor is Special Agent in Charge Thomas Martinez. You can call him to verify." Peterson grabbed Diana's arm, spinning her around roughly. "Oh, you've really done your homework, haven't you? Even made up a whole backstory." His face was inches from hers now, his breath hot with anger. "Well, guess what? Adding impersonating a federal agent to your charges is going to make this a very bad night for you. The only one having a bad night will be you," Diana said calmly, looking directly into his eyes. "Everything you're doing is being recorded. Everything you're saying is evidence. And when this is over—" The handcuffs snapped around her wrists before she could finish, Peterson applying them tight enough to bite into her skin. "That's another charge, threatening a police officer," Peterson declared loudly, clearly playing to his body camera. But his next words were quieter, meant only for Diana's ears. "You people never learn, do you? Always thinking you're above the law." More police cars were arriving now, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Two younger officers stepped out, looking uncertain as they took in the situation. "What's the problem here, Peterson?" one of them asked, eyeing Diana's professional appearance and calm demeanor with obvious confusion. "Got a perpetrator impersonating a federal agent," Peterson announced proudly. "Claims she's FBI, probably involved in some kind of scam." "My credentials are in my purse," Diana stated loudly enough for everyone to hear, "along with my FBI badge number 47,291. Any of you can call the Richmond Field Office to verify my identity. Ask for Sassy Martinez or Assistant Director Thompson." The younger officers exchanged glances. One of them whispered something to his partner, who nodded and stepped away, pulling out his phone. Peterson, noticing this, barked, "She's under arrest. Get her in the car now." "Officer," a man from the crowd called out, holding up his phone, "I've got this whole thing on video. She hasn't done anything wrong." "That's it." Peterson turned toward the crowd. "Everyone disperse now, or you're all going to jail." As Diana was led toward the patrol car, she caught fragments of conversation from her backup phone in her jacket pocket, still connected to her mother. "Mom, if you're still listening, call Assistant Director Thompson. Tell them Special Agent Wells is being arrested by Richmond PD Officer Peterson on Maple Street. And Mom, tell them to hurry." The patrol car's back door opened, and Diana ducked her head to enter, knowing that while this moment was humiliating, it would soon become one of the biggest mistakes of Officer Peterson's career. As the door slammed shut, she could see more phone cameras recording, more patrol cars arriving, and the first seeds of doubt beginning to show on the faces of Peterson's fellow officers. The night was far from over. The back seat of Officer Peterson's patrol car smelled of stale sweat and despair. Diana sat straight-backed despite her handcuffs, her mind already documenting every detail of her unlawful arrest. Through the wire mesh divider, she could hear Peterson arguing with his fellow officers outside. I don't care what she says. Peterson's voice was getting louder. She's lying about being FBI. I mean, look at her. Since when do they hire? He caught himself again, but the prejudice in his voice was clear as day. Officer Sarah Martinez, one of the younger officers who had arrived as backup, stepped closer to Peterson. Jim, I really think we should verify her credentials before. Are you questioning my judgment? Peterson's face had turned an angry red. I've been on the force for 15 years. I know a fake badge when I see one. Diana watched through the window as more police cars arrived at the scene. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, many with their phones raised, recording everything. Some were shouting at the officers, demanding Diana's release. Officer Martinez tried again. I called the number she gave us. The FBI office is sending someone tow. Then we better get her to the station before they arrive. Peterson cut in, climbing into the driver's seat. He turned to glare at Diana through the mesh. You've caused enough trouble for one night. As Peterson started the engine, Diana spoke clearly, knowing the patrol car's internal camera was recording. Officer Peterson, this is your final chance to correct your mistake. I am a federal agent. By refusing to verify my credentials and placing me under arrest, you're committing a federal offense. Peterson's laugh was harsh. Keep talking. Every threat you make is another charge. He pulled away from the curb, leaving the other officers and the angry crowd behind. Diana noticed he wasn't taking the direct route to the police station. Instead, he was choosing darker, less traveled streets. She recognized this tactic. It was meant to intimidate her. You know what your kind's problem is? Peterson spoke into the rear-view mirror. You get a nice suit, maybe a fake badge, and suddenly you think you're better than everyone else. Think you can just go wherever you want, do whatever you want. Diana remained silent, but her eyes never left Peterson's reflection. She could see the sweat on his forehead, the nervous way he kept adjusting his collar. Despite his bravado, he was starting to realize he might have made a terrible mistake. Nothing to say now, Peterson taunted. What happened to all those big threats about being FBI? Officer Peterson, Diana's voice was calm and measured. My mother is still on my phone, which is recording everything. Assistant Director Thompson has already been notified. Right now, your best option is to turn this car around. Peterson's grip tightened on the steering wheel. More lies. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Suddenly, Peterson's radio crackled to life. Unit 47, this is dispatch. You need to return to the station immediately. Captain Rogers wants to speak with you about your current arrest. Peterson grabbed the radio. Dispatch, I'm transporting a suspect who's impersonating a federal agent. Tell the captain I'll be there after processing. Negative, Unit 47. The dispatcher's voice was firm. Return to the station immediately. FBI personnel are en route. This is a direct order from the captain. Diana watched as the color drained from Peterson's face. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression. This is your last chance, Diana said quietly. The difference between a major mistake and a career-ending one often comes down to how quickly you admit you were wrong. Peterson's response was to press harder on the accelerator. We'll see who's wrong when we get to the station. As they turned onto Main Street, Diana saw something that made her smile slightly. 2 black SUVs with federal plates were heading in their direction, lights flashing. In the lead vehicle, she recognized the stern face of Assistant Director Thompson. Peterson saw them too. His hands began to shake on the steering wheel as the SUVs pulled up behind him, their lights bathing the patrol car in red and white. Unit 47, pull over immediately. The dispatcher's voice was now urgent. FBI agents are behind you. Captain Rogers orders you to stop the vehicle now. As Peterson reluctantly pulled to the curb, Diana caught his frightened eyes in the rearview mirror. Officer Peterson, she said softly, I believe this is what they call karma. The night had just gotten very interesting indeed. The Richmond police station buzzed with unusual activity for a weekday evening. Officers gathered in small groups, whispering and stealing glances at the main entrance where Officer Peterson was being escorted in, followed by an angry Assistant Director Thompson and 3 stern-faced FBI agents. In the middle of this procession walked Diana Wells, her head held high despite the handcuffs still on her wrists. Get these cuffs off her right now. Thompson's voice boomed through the station, making several rookie officers jump. He was a tall black man in his 50s, wearing an immaculate suit and an expression that could melt steel. Captain Rogers, a gray-haired veteran of the force, rushed from his office. "Get those handcuffs off immediately," he ordered Peterson, who now looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Peterson's hands shook as he fumbled with the keys. When he finally removed the handcuffs, angry red marks were visible on Diana's wrists. "Document those marks," Thompson instructed one of his agents, who immediately started taking photos. "This is evidence." Captain Rogers stepped forward, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. "Special Agent Wells, on behalf of the Richmond Police Department, I want to express our deepest—" "Save it," Thompson cut him off. "We'll need your largest conference room, access to all body camera footage, dash cam videos, and Officer Peterson's complete personnel file. Now." The station erupted into action. Peterson stood awkwardly to the side, his arrogant demeanor completely gone. Several officers who had gathered to watch suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. "Mom." Diana spoke into her phone, which had been retrieved from her car. "Yes, I'm okay. Thank you for calling the office. Yes, Director Thompson is here. No, you don't need to come down. I'll still make it to Sunday dinner, I promise." In the conference room, the situation went from bad to worse for Peterson. The body camera footage played on a large screen, showing every moment of his prejudiced behavior. His face grew paler with each racist comment and aggressive action displayed. 15 complaints of racial profiling in the past 3 years, an FBI agent raid from Peterson's personnel file, all dismissed without proper investigation. Captain Rogers wiped sweat from his forehead. There were no concrete evidence. No evidence. Thompson's voice was sharp. Or no interest in finding any. Diana sat at the conference table, now holding an ice pack to her wrists. She watched as more evidence of Peterson's past misconduct emerged. Other officers had started coming forward, sharing stories they had previously kept quiet about. Officer Sarah Martinez knocked and entered the room. "Sir," she addressed Captain Rogers, "there are news vans outside. The videos from witnesses are already on social media." Peterson finally found his voice. I was just doing my job. How was I supposed to know she was really FBI?" The room fell silent. Diana stood up slowly, every eye on her. "Your job?" Her voice was quiet but carried throughout the room. "Your job was to verify my credentials when I offered to show them. Your job was to treat every citizen with respect, regardless of their race. Your job was to protect and serve, not harass and discriminate." She walked over to Peterson, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "You didn't fail to recognize I was FBI. You failed to recognize my humanity. That's not doing your job. That's abusing your power." Thompson nodded approvingly. "Officer Peterson, you are facing serious federal charges. Civil rights violations, assault on a federal agent, false arrest." "Please." Peterson's voice cracked. "I have a family. I can't lose my pension." "You should have thought about that before you decided to make assumptions based on the color of my skin," Diana replied calmly. "Actions have consequences, Officer Peterson. Tonight, you're learning about both." Captain Rogers cleared his throat. "Officer Peterson, surrender your badge and gun. You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation." As Peterson slowly removed his badge, Diana turned to Thompson. "Sir, I want this to be more than just one officer's punishment. The whole department needs reform." Thompson smiled grimly. "Oh, it will be. By the time we're done here, the Richmond PD won't recognize itself." He turned to Captain Rogers. "And you're going to cooperate fully, aren't you, Captain?" The night had started with one racist officer's bad decision. It was ending with the beginning of real change. Hence. The next morning, Diana's story was everywhere. Cell phone videos of her arrest had gone viral overnight, and news vans lined up outside the Richmond Police Department like vultures waiting for their next meal. Inside the station's largest conference room, Assistant Director Thompson stood at the head of a long table, surrounded by FBI agents, internal affairs investigators, and civil rights attorneys. The room hummed with activity as everyone reviewed files, watched videos, and pieced together the full extent of Officer Peterson's misconduct. "Look at this," Agent Rodriguez called out, holding up a file. 3 months ago, Peterson arrested a black female doctor for suspicious behavior. She was just jogging in her own neighborhood. Diana, now dressed in a fresh suit, sat next to Thompson, reviewing complaints against Peterson that had been previously buried. Her wrists still showed faint marks from the handcuffs, which department photographers had thoroughly documented. Channel 7 is running the story again, Officer Martinez reported, pointing to the television mounted on the wall. The screen showed footage from the previous night. Peterson's aggressive behavior, the gathering crowd, and finally, Diana being forced into the police car. The news anchor's voice filled the room. In a shocking incident of racial profiling, Richmond police officer James Peterson arrested FBI Special Agent Diana Wells last night, refusing to acknowledge her credentials. Sources say Officer Peterson has a history of similar incidents. Captain Rogers entered the room, looking like he hadn't slept all night. The mayor is on his way. He's not happy. He's not happy. Thompson's voice dripped with sarcasm. Well, imagine how Agent Wells felt being handcuffed and treated like a criminal for driving while black. The door burst open as Mayor Richardson strode in, his face tight with concern. He was a tall man in his 60s, and right now he looked every bit his age. "This is a disaster," the mayor announced, dropping a stack of newspapers on the table. Every front page showed Diana's story. "The governor just called. The Department of Justice is sending people. We need to get ahead of this." Diana stood up, her presence commanding attention. "With all due respect, Mayor Richardson, getting ahead of this isn't about managing public relations. It's about addressing the root cause." She walked to the whiteboard where they had been mapping Peterson's history of complaints. This officer had 15 documented complaints of racial profiling. 15. And that's just the people who were brave enough to come forward. 23 now, Rodriguez interrupted, holding up his phone. More victims came forward after seeing the news. They're all telling similar stories. The mayor sank into a chair, looking defeated. "What do you want us to do?" Thompson stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the table. "This is what's going to happen. The FBI Civil Rights Division is launching a full investigation into the Richmond PD. Every complaint, every incident, every dismissed case will be reviewed." "That could take months," Captain Rogers protested. "Years, actually," Diana corrected him. "And during that time, this department will implement comprehensive bias training, review all hiring and promotion practices, and establish a civilian oversight committee." The mayor rubbed his temples. "The police union won't like this." "The police union isn't facing federal charges," Thompson reminded him sharply. "Officer Peterson is, and depending on what we find, he might not be the only one." Outside the conference room, they could hear phones ringing constantly as more people called to report similar experiences with Peterson and other officers. "Sir, an FBI agent entered with a tablet. Officer Peterson's requesting to speak with Agent Wells. Says he wants to apologize." Diana exchanged looks with Thompson, who nodded slightly. "Tell them I'll speak with him," Diana said, "but only with his union representative and our attorneys present. And everything gets recorded." As the agent left to arrange the meeting, Diana turned to the room. "What happened to me was terrible, but I'm an FBI agent. I have resources and authority many victims of racial profiling don't have. This isn't just about me or Officer Peterson. This is about changing a system that allowed him to abuse his power for years." The mayor looked at the news footage still playing on the TV. "This is going to change everything." "That's the point," Diana replied firmly. "Sometimes it takes one incident to expose years of injustice. Officer Peterson didn't just arrest the wrong person last night. He gave us the key to forcing real change." Thompson smiled proudly at his agent. The day was just beginning, but the wheels of justice were already turning at full speed. 2 weeks after the arrest incident, the Richmond Police Department found itself under an intense microscope. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had set up a temporary office in the building next door, and a stream of people came forward daily to share their stories about Officer Peterson and others like him. Diana sat in her office at the FBI field office, reviewing the latest batch of complaints. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was time for Peterson's official interview. As she gathered her files, she remembered his attempt at an apology last week, which had seemed more concerned with saving his job than showing true remorse. "Ready for this?" Thompson asked, meeting her in the hallway. They both knew this interview would be different. Today, They had evidence. Lots of it. The interview room was small and stark. Peterson sat there with his union representative and lawyer, looking much smaller without his uniform and badge. His face had the tired look of a man who hadn't slept properly in days. "Officer Peterson," Diana began, setting down a thick folder. "Or should I say, former Officer Peterson." Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His lawyer leaned forward. "My client is here voluntarily to cooperate with your investigation." "Good," Thompson said, opening his laptop. "Because we have some interesting findings to discuss." He turned the screen to show a spreadsheet. "In the past 3 years, you pulled over 1,247 drivers. Want to guess the racial breakdown of those stops?" Peterson's face paled. His union representative whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head. "Of those stops," Diana continued, "82% were minorities. Of those minorities, 94% were either arrested or ticketed. But of the white drivers you stopped, only 23% received citations." She looked directly at Peterson. "Care to explain that disparity?" I was just doing my job," Peterson mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Really?" Thompson pulled out more papers. "Like when you arrested Dr. Sarah Johnson for jogging in her own neighborhood, or when you held Professor Michael Torres at gunpoint for suspicious behavior while he was gardening in his front yard." Diana laid out photographs of other victims. "These people lost jobs, missed important events, faced humiliation, all because you decided they didn't belong in certain neighborhoods." Peterson's lawyer tried to intervene. "My client maintains that these were legitimate stops based on reasonable suspicion." "Save it," Thompson cut in. "We have the body cam footage. All of it, including the comments he made when he thought the camera was off." Diana played a series of clips. Peterson's voice filled the room, making racist remarks and bragging to other officers about targeting minorities. With each clip, Peterson seemed to shrink further into his chair. "Here's what's going to happen," Diana stated firmly. "The district attorney is pressing criminal charges for civil rights violations. The FBI is recommending federal charges for my false arrest. And every single person you wrongly arrested or harassed now has grounds for civil lawsuits." "I'll lose everything," Peterson whispered. "Like how Dr. Johnson lost her hospital privileges after being late for surgery because you held her for 2 hours?" Diana asked. "Or how Mr. Torres lost his teaching position because your false arrest showed up on his background check." Thompson leaned forward. "But you have one chance, just one, to minimize the damage. We want names, other officers who participated in or covered up discriminatory practices, supervisors who dismissed complaints, everyone who helped maintain the system." Peterson looked at his union representative, who nodded grimly. "If I talk," Peterson began. "You'll still face charges," Diana said firmly. "But cooperation will be noted in sentencing recommendations. And right now, that's the best deal you're going to get." For the next 3 hours, Peterson talked. He named names, provided dates, and described an informal system of targeting minorities that made everyone in the room feel sick. As they left the interview room, Thompson turned to Diana. "This is bigger than we thought. Half the department might be implicated." Diana nodded. "Good. Sometimes you need to tear everything down to rebuild it properly." Outside, more people waited to file complaints. The investigation was growing, and with each news story, the chance for real change grew stronger. Peterson's karma hadn't just taken down one racist cop. It was about to transform an entire police department. 3 months after Diana's arrest, the Richmond Police Department faced its day of reckoning. The main courtroom of the federal building was packed with reporters, community members, and police officers as the Justice Department prepared to announce its findings. Diana sat in the front row beside Assistant Director Thompson, watching as Peterson and 6 other officers were led into the courtroom in handcuffs. Gone were their proud uniforms, replaced by civilian clothes and defeated expressions. Peterson couldn't even lift his eyes from the floor when he passed by her. "All rise." The bailiff called out as Judge Maria Santos entered the courtroom. She was known for her tough stance on civil rights violations, and today her face showed no mercy. "Before we begin," Judge Santos addressed the crowded room, "I want to acknowledge the courage of those who came forward." Special Agent Wells's incident opened the door, but hundreds of citizens helped us see the full picture. The U.S. Attorney stepped forward with a thick stack of documents. Your Honor, the investigation has uncovered systematic discrimination within the Richmond Police Department spanning over a decade. We have documented evidence of 847 cases of racial profiling, false arrests, and civil rights violations. From her seat, Diana could see Captain Rogers and several senior officers squirming uncomfortably in their chairs. They had all been forced to resign last month when their role in covering up complaints came to light. The U.S. Attorney continued. Officer James Peterson and 6 other officers are pleading guilty to multiple federal charges. Additionally, 15 former supervisors face charges for deliberately ignoring or hiding evidence of misconduct. Peterson's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, my client wishes to address the court. Judge Santos nodded. Peterson walked to the podium, his handcuffs clinking in the silent courtroom. His voice cracked. I want to apologize, not just to Agent Wells, but to everyone I hurt. I abused my power. I let my prejudices control my actions. I destroyed lives because of my racism. Tears ran down his face. I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to make it right by helping expose others who did the same. Diana listened carefully to his words. They seemed more genuine than his first attempt at an apology, but only time would tell if he truly understood the depth of his wrongdoing. Judge Santos spoke firmly. Mr. Peterson, your cooperation has been noted. However, the severity of your actions cannot be ignored. She lifted her gavel. For the multiple counts of civil rights violations, false arrest of a federal agent, and other charges, I sentence you to 5 years in federal prison. The gavel struck with finality. Peterson's shoulders slumped as he was led away. But the day wasn't over. The mayor approached the podium next, looking nervous but determined. In light of these findings, the city of Richmond is announcing complete reform of our police department, he declared. We're implementing mandatory body cameras with automatic upload to an independent server. All officers will undergo extensive bias training. We're establishing a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate complaints. And we're creating a special unit, led by Special Agent Wells, to review all past cases for potential discrimination. Murmurs filled the courtroom. Diana hadn't expected this last announcement. Thompson leaned over, whispering, "They specifically requested you," said they needed someone who understood both law enforcement and the importance of fairness. The judge had one final announcement. The court orders the Richmond Police Department to pay $10 million in compensation to victims of documented discrimination. Special Agent Wells's case will be used to train future officers on what not to do. As people began filing out of the courtroom, reporters rushed to get comments. Diana stood by the courthouse steps, facing the cameras. Today isn't about revenge, she stated clearly. It's about justice and change. Officer Peterson's actions were terrible, but they exposed a deeper problem. Now we have a chance to fix it. A young black girl in the crowd raised her hand. Agent Wells, do you think things will really change? Diana smiled at her. Change is already happening. Look around. Police officers are being held accountable, victims are being heard, and new policies are being put in place. But the most important change is in people's minds. We're showing everyone that justice is possible if we're brave enough to demand it. As the crowd dispersed, Diana knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long journey toward real change. Sometimes, karma didn't just punish the wrongdoer. It created opportunities for transformation. 1 year after Officer Peterson's arrest of Diana Wells, the Richmond Police Department looked very different. The old guard was gone, replaced by a new generation of officers trained under strict anti-bias policies. But the biggest change stood at the front of the training room today, Special Agent Diana Wells herself. Good morning. Diana addressed the room full of police cadets and veteran officers. Today's training is called the Peterson Incident. How not to let bias destroy your career and hurt your community. The room was silent as she clicked to the first slide, the now famous video of her arrest. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Diana had learned that discomfort often preceded real change. Officer Peterson is now in his 2nd year of a 5-year prison sentence, Diana continued. But this isn't just his story. This is about how unchecked bias can poison an entire system. In the back of the room, Assistant Director Thompson watched proudly. The training program Diana had developed was now being adopted by police departments across the country. "Let me show you something interesting," Diana said, pulling up new statistics. "In the past year since our reforms began, complaints against officers have dropped by 78%. Public trust in the department has increased by 65%, and most importantly, our arrest rates now match the actual demographics of our community." A young officer raised her hand. "But what if we're afraid to make legitimate arrests now? What if we're too worried about being called racist?" Diana smiled. This was her favorite question. "That's why we teach you to focus on behavior, not bias. When I arrest someone, I can point to specific actions that broke the law. Peterson couldn't do that with me. He saw my skin color and made assumptions. That's the difference." She clicked to the next slide, showing Peterson's current prison photo. "Last week, I visited Peterson in prison. He's teaching other inmates about bias and its consequences. He told me something interesting. He said, 'I thought I was protecting my community, but I was actually destroying it.'" The room grew quiet again. Diana continued, "But here's the good news. You all have a chance to do better. Richmond PD is now a model for other departments. People come from all over the country to study our reforms." At that moment, Mayor Richardson entered the room with a group of visitors, police chiefs from major cities, all here to learn about Richmond's transformation. "As you can see," the mayor announced proudly, "Special Agent Wells doesn't just teach about what went wrong. She shows us how to make things right." Diana moved to her closing slides. "Your new body cameras upload automatically to servers controlled by the Civilian Oversight Board. Every traffic stop is reviewed randomly. But these aren't restrictions, they're protections. They protect good officers from false accusations and help identify those who need more training." She showed pictures of community events where officers and citizens work together. "Last month, we had former victims of profiling sitting down with officers for dinner and dialogue. Real change happens person by person, conversation by conversation." After the training, Thompson approached Diana. "The FBI director called. They want to make your program national. Every FBI agent and every police department in the country would go through this training." Diana nodded, thinking of how far they'd come. "You know what the best part is? Peterson's karma didn't just punish him, it created a wave of positive change. His mistake became a catalyst for transformation." Later that evening, Diana drove home along the same street where Peterson had pulled her over. The street looked the same, but everything else was different. New police cars had QR codes that citizens could scan to immediately report problems. Officers walked their beats in pairs, one always from a minority community. The Civilian Oversight Board office was always lit up, showing they were available 24/7. As she pulled into her driveway, Diana saw her neighbor, a young black teenager, chatting comfortably with two patrol officers. Last year, that scene would have made her nervous. Now it made her hopeful. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thompson. "Justice Department says complaints of racial profiling down 50% nationally since departments started using your training program. Karma isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation." Diana smiled. Sometimes the worst moments in life led to the best changes. Peterson had tried to humiliate her because of her race, but his actions had instead sparked a revolution in policing. That was the ultimate karma, turning bias into blessing, turning pain into progress. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was real. And it all started with one traffic stop on a quiet evening in Richmond.